The first clue did not arrive as a skeleton, a vault, or a scandal. It arrived as paperwork. I found it folded inside a bundle of municipal plans stamped with the dull authority of the Edinburgh City Survey Office, dated 1861. The sheets were yellowed, edges softened by time, the ink faint but stubbornly legible. They concerned an underground expansion near the Old Town Ridge, drainage improvements, foundation reinforcement, cellar extensions beneath newly purchased property. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. That was the point. Survey grids marched across the paper in neat rectangles. Depth measurements were penciled into margins. Cross-sections showed soil layers stacked with bureaucratic confidence. Clay, gravel, bedrock. The language was precise, procedural, almost soothing. This was how cities recorded their own growth, quietly, methodically, without spectacle. Yet, when I compared these plans to later street-level diagrams from the same district, something refused to line up. The road surfaces had risen, not slightly, substantially. Stairwells that should have opened onto basements now met pavement at mid-window height. Foundation depths recorded in the 1860s no longer matched 20th century engineering reports for the same parcels of land. The numbers did not contradict each other outright. They slid past one another, close enough to avoid alarm, far enough to nag at the edges of logic. I kept tracing signatures. The same clocks appeared again and again across different permits, engineers approving soil removal, inspectors initialing structural revisions, anonymous labor supervisors listed only by surname, their handwriting repeating across years of subterranean projects beneath the same cluster of streets. No commentary accompanied the approvals, no justifications for altered measurements, no explanatory memoranda filed afterward. Cities generate mountains of paper. That is their nature. What caught my attention was not what these documents said, but what they never bothered to explain. One page in particular broke the rhythm. In the margin of a foundation diagram, squeezed between two depth calculations, sat a brief penciled note written in a different hand. Unexpected cavities. No elaboration, no follow-up sheet attached, no later reference in subsequent permits. And just those two words. In a system obsessed with specification, the absence of detail felt louder than any alarm bell. Cavities were not decorative. They implied voids where none should exist. Spaces interrupting the assumed continuity of soil and stone beneath a medieval city already layered with centuries of construction. I searched for amendments, supplemental surveys, engineers' addenda. Nothing. Yet, the project moved forward. Reinforcements approved, excavations recorded as completed, streets repaved, buildings erected. Whatever those cavities had been, the paperwork absorbed them without protest. Standing back from the plans, I felt the shape of the puzzle begin to change. This was not a story that started with catastrophe. It began with routine, with clipboards and ink stamps, with men whose job it was to normalize whatever they encountered underground. And somewhere beneath those neat Victorian diagrams, something had interrupted that routine just long enough to leave a faint graphite scar in the margin, before vanishing again beneath the weight of approvals and asphalt. If the city had encountered something worth remembering, its first instinct had not been to announce it. It had been to file it. The next race surfaced not in council chambers, but beneath them. Newspaper clippings from the early 1860s recorded routine cellar expansions beneath tenements edging the Old Town slope. The articles were brief, tucked between shipping notices and court listings, their tone technical rather than alarmed. Crews widening storage rooms for coal and provisions had encountered stonework that did not resemble medieval footings or modern retaining walls. The phrasing was careful. Unanticipated masonry. Arch structure of unknown origin, no adjectives that suggested wonder, no speculation. I followed the citations back to excavation reports filed at the city. Measurements dominated the pages. Wall thickness recorded in inches, curvature ratios sketched beside load calculations. Chambers sealed with mortar that required new tools to penetrate, everything written as if such finds were inconvenient rather than extraordinary. Foremen appeared only through signatures, surveyors through stamped approvals, inspectors through initials that confirmed structural stability and authorized continued digging. None paused to ask what sort of building lay beneath another building. None proposed halting work. They acknowledged scale, noted geometry, then returned to progress schedules. The calmness was the most unsettling feature. One paragraph referenced remnants of interior partitioning, then moved on to drainage, rerouting. Another noted that several cavities had been sealed after inspection without detailing what they had contained. Only once did the press approach the edge of specificity, hinting that workmen had encountered material suggestive of interment. No elaboration followed. No anatomical descriptions, no counts, no follow-up articles. The silence felt procedural rather than accidental, the kind produced when curiosity loses to deadlines and building permits outweigh whatever rests below floorboards. What should have triggered inquiry instead generated paperwork. I began assembling a list of later documents that should have existed if bodies had truly been found. Transfer orders, medical consultations, burial authorizations, museum inquiries, police records. The archive offered nothing, which meant the next stage of the investigation could no longer remain underground. If something had been uncovered in those chambers, its disappearance would have left marks somewhere else, on desks, in ledgers, in files that outlived the men who signed them. The paper trail did not end with excavation reports. It spread outward. Permit renewals from the decades after 1861 showed the same parcels of land resurfacing again and again in municipal files. Sewer upgrades, street leveling, structural reinforcement. Each project framed as routine urban maintenance. Each stamped with fresh approvals that treated the ground beneath as newly understood territory. Yet when I laid the maps side by side, decade against decade, the subterranean details began to dissolve. Early plans showed voids and irregular stonework sketched in light pencil. Later versions replaced them with clean rectangles labeled foundation fill. Depth figures changed by inches, then by feet. Chambers became soil. Arches became rubble. What had once required annotations no longer required acknowledgement at all. The same names repeated in the margins, clerks copying measurements forward, planning committees ratifying alterations without comment, sanitation boards authorizing drainage through spaces that earlier engineers had treated as structural anomalies. No debates recorded, no dissenting notes preserved. Only subtraction. Missing sketches were the most conspicuous absence. References to supplemental diagrams appeared in meeting agendas, yet the diagrams themselves had vanished from the folders that should have housed them. In their place sat newer drafts, simplified and smooth, as if complexity had been inconvenient rather than mysterious. One council meeting drew my attention more than any other. The minutes progressed through budget approvals and labor allocations, then stopped abruptly halfway down a page. The next meeting resumed weeks later with no reference to what had interrupted the session. No adjournment noted. No topic concluded. Just a blank space where discussion should have continued. By then, suspicion no longer came from what the archives contained. It came from what they steadily erased. If the ground beneath Edinburgh had once required explanation, the city's paperwork was learning how to forget it. And whatever had prompted that forgetting appeared to coincide with redevelopment phases that sealed those zones beneath new stone, new pavement, and new layers of civic certainty. The next documents I needed would not describe streets. They would describe the dead. The maps had taught the city how to forget its underground spaces. The burial records taught it how to forget bodies. The parish ledgers from the years following the cellar excavations sat in climate-controlled drawers, thick volumes bound in leather, darkened by handling. Their pages were ruled with columns for name, age, cause of death, plot number, coffin type, depth. I began copying entries into parallel lists, not hunting for a single anomaly, but for clusters, spikes, deviations from background mortality that coincided with redevelopment near the Old Town Ridge. At first, the numbers behaved. Infant deaths in winter months. Industrial accidents near the docks, outbreaks of fever that moved street by street, the rhythms of a 19th century city asserting itself through ink. Then the outliers emerged, coffin lengths recorded in feet rather than inches, then left without commentary. Burial depths marked deeper than parish norms, justified only by a check mark in the margin, an occasional annotation that suggested reinforcement of vault walls rather than soil packing, not frequent enough to be sensational, persistent enough to resist dismissal. Hospital death rolls offered no clarifying counterpart. Patients admitted with fractures, infections, wasting illnesses. Heights were rarely noted, except in a few early surgical registries that recorded unusual proportions before the column. Disappeared entirely from later forms. The handwriting changed. Gravediggers signed in cramped cursive. Clerics wrote with flourished capitals. Physicians favored angular strokes that compressed diagnoses into narrow margins. Their personalities surfaced only through pen pressure and ink density, yet together they formed a bureaucracy of mortality that rarely paused to elaborate. What unsettled me were the vanishings, categories that appeared once and never again. Measurements struck through and replaced with blank space. A sequence of unusually large coffins followed by months of normal entries, as if the anomaly had been quarantined on paper. I tracked plot numbers. Most appeared once, then dissolved into the city's geography forever. One did not. It resurfaced in a hospital ledger months later, then in a burial register from a neighboring parish, then in a cemetery maintenance log listing reinforcement work on a subsurface chamber beneath the same coordinates. The entries never described what lay inside, only that multiple interments had occurred, only that masonry had required attention, only that records had been consolidated. By then, the shift from stone to bone no longer felt speculative. The documents were offering two parallel languages, architecture above, bodies below, each speaking in its own constrained vocabulary, each avoiding the same details. I searched for anatomical descriptions that might have resolved the ambiguity. There were none. No skeletal measurements preserved in municipal archives. No pathology sketches in teaching hospitals. No public notices requesting examination by learned societies. The restraint felt deliberate, though the documents themselves never admitted intention. What they did admit was repetition, the same plot number, crossing registers, the same district undergoing reinforcement, the same year returning with quiet insistence. Whatever had been encountered underground had not remained there. It had been processed, filed, yet redistributed across ledgers that, taken alone, looked unremarkable. Only when assembled did they begin to suggest that something biological had followed the stonework into the archive, and that once recorded, it had been carefully reduced to numbers small enough to fit inside ruled columns. The next step could not remain in parish basements. If bodies had been removed from the ground, they should have gone somewhere meant to keep them. And if that place existed, its shells would tell a story the cemeteries would not. By the time municipal files and burial registers began closing ranks, another paper trail had already diverged from the official route. Private correspondence, estate inventories, letters exchanged between men who did not sign council minutes or hospital forms, but who itemized curiosities with the patience of collectors and the discretion of traders. Antiquarian circles in 19th century Edinburgh operated in parallel to academic institutions, exchanging artifacts through salons, private viewings, and catalogues never meant for public circulation. Their language was oblique, bone length reduced to initials, chamber masonry described as non-conforming, implements listed only by weight, never function. I began assembling these fragments from probate records and auction notices buried in periodicals devoted to mineral specimens and antiquities. One estate included crates described as subterranean salvage. Another referenced architectural remains extracted prior to redevelopment. A third recorded transportation fees for objects too heavy to be furniture, yet too specific to be stone. No provenance, no excavation site named, only districts implied through street abbreviations and river access fees that traced back to the same slopes and drainage corridors already appearing in city plans. Auctioneers surfaced as signatures at the bottom of tight inventories. Correspondence appeared as initials embedded in flowing cursive. Their networks formed invisible conduits through which objects moved sideways, bypassing universities and municipal oversight entirely. What mattered was not any single letter. It was recurrence. The same coded phrases used by different hands. The same freight companies hired to move sealed crates at night. The same districts referenced through shorthand that avoided exact addresses while remaining unmistakable to anyone familiar with the terrain. Patterns replaced declarations. One exchange paused mid-sentence. Dimensions exceed, followed by an abrupt line break. Then a shift to pricing. Another mentioned reinforcement straps added during removal, as if whatever had been lifted from underground resisted peasy transport. Still, none used the word remains. None wrote skeleton. The omissions felt deliberate, shared, inherited. When I mapped the origins of these shipments, the clustering became impossible to ignore. Old town ridges, canal-fed storehouses, burial grounds, bordering redevelopment zones. The same geography, repeated under different disguises, threaded through personal networks rather than civic infrastructure, which raised a question the public archives refused to answer. If bodies and masonry had not been destroyed, then they had been relocated. And if relocation had occurred, it had not favored lecture halls or museum galleries. It had favored locked rooms, restricted catalogues, repositories whose registers were stamped for internal use only, opened rarely, sometimes never, preserved by curators who inherited shelves without inheriting explanations. The investigation could no longer remain among private collectors. If anything substantial had survived the removals, its final destination would have been institutional, behind accession numbers, behind sealed cabinets, behind lists that most researchers were never meant to see. Museum records do not speak in narrative, they speak in columns. Dates, accession numbers, shelf designations, crate dimensions reduced to measurements that feel almost apologetic in their precision. I began tracing storage ledgers. From the same decades, the private collectors had been circulating letters, expecting at least one convergence point where private curiosity became public custody. Instead, I found absence disguised as order. Entire sequences of catalog numbers existed without corresponding object descriptions. Crates listed as received were followed by transfer slips without destinations. Oversized storage bays appeared in architectural plans for new museum wings, annotated with reinforcement requirements and load tolerances that exceeded anything normally associated with fossils. Furniture or sculpture committees replaced collectors here, panels that approved relocations, clerks who signed off on reclassification, transport contractors whose invoices survived long after the objects themselves had evaporated from the shelves they were meant to occupy. One register noted a delivery requiring 3 wagons and rail priority clearance. The entry was stamped, filed, and then followed by a blank page. No follow-up, no accession photograph, no display record. In another archive, the same crate number surfaced again months later, crossed out in red ink and reassigned to a shipment of mineral samples. The handwriting did not match. The paper stock did. Parallel systems had been operating inside the same institutions, public catalogs, internal inventories, lists meant for visitors and lists meant for logistics. They rarely intersected. When I aligned museum manifests with railway freight logs, the paper trail tightened instead of loosening. A sealed cargo left Edinburgh under escort, designated for climate-controlled storage, scheduled to arrive at a southern repository within 48 hours. There was no arrival entry. The rail company recorded the carriage's release. The destination ledger recorded nothing. Between them lay a silence measured in tons. Not dramatic, administrative, routine enough that no inquiry was triggered. or at least none that survived in the files. What unsettled me was not the missing crate, it was how easily the absence fit into the system, how procedures continued, how numbering sequences closed over it, how departments resumed issuing permits, allocating shelf space, approving budgets, as if the gap was structural rather than anomalous. Burial sites had vanished beneath redevelopment. Collectors had diverted material into private rooms. Now institutions themselves appeared to absorb the remnants and dissolve them into paperwork. The strongest connection yet had emerged, not through scandal or exposure, but through logistics, through freight schedules, through storage diagrams, through shells designed for objects that no longer had names. And for the first time, the erasure no longer looked local. It looked coordinated by process. By the time museum inventories began thinning, the ground itself had already started to rise. 19th century geological surveys and drainage proposals reframed the city's underground not as a static inheritance, but as a space in constant negotiation. Street elevations were recalculated. Foundations were underpinned, sewers widened. Entire gradients adjusted to accommodate runoff, sanitation, and new traffic loads. On paper, these projects appeared mundane, necessary, administrative responses to a growing population and the engineering fashions of the age, yet buried in their margins were measurements that did not belong to routine upgrades. Survey tables recorded voids at depths inconsistent with medieval basements. Bore samples described compacted fill overlaying worked stone rather than natural strata. Drainage tunnels were diverted around pre-existing cavities rather than cutting through them, as if avoidance had been easier than explanation. Engineering offices entered the record here, not as arbiters of mystery, but as custodians of inconvenient facts. Their diagrams preserved what prose refused to acknowledge. Cross-sections showed sealed arches beneath new pavements. Load calculations referenced subsurface chambers never labeled in accompanying text. Reinforcement schedules thickened precisely where burial registers had grown vague. What unsettled me was simultaneity. Street raisings occurred across multiple wards within the same decade. Sediment infill followed identical specifications in districts miles apart. Brick plugs sealed access shafts beneath courtyards, tenements, and tram routes, each logged as maintenance rather than discovery. Cemetery plots, collectors' letters, museum crates, now civic improvement campaigns. The correlations stacked without comment, accumulating density rather than spectacle. No single document suggested intention. Together, they implied scope. The labor required to level streets over voids was substantial. Tons of material imported, drain lines rerouted, foundations recalculated. Such coordination demanded planning cycles, budget approvals, multi-year oversight. Someone had noticed the cavities long before asphalt sealed them. Whether the motive was ignorance, convenience, or something quieter remained unresolved. What mattered was outcome. Old spaces disappeared beneath new ones. Access shafts vanished under pavements. The city's surface thickened while its substructure slipped further from reach. And for the first time, the pattern no longer felt limited to records. It felt embedded in the streets themselves. Whatever lay beneath Edinburgh in 1861 had not simply been forgotten. It had been paved over. Once the Edinburgh records began aligning with themselves, the comparison widened outward. Other British cities left behind traces of similar adjustments. Municipal proceedings from Liverpool, Glasgow, Manchester, and Bristol contained the same restrained vocabulary. Oversized coffins, recorded without comment. Burial vaults reclassified as drainage chambers. Strut elevations justified through sanitation rather than discovery. Planning minutes referenced pre-existing masonry beneath districts officially traced only to medieval or early modern. Occupation. National archives entered the picture here, not as arbiters of truth, but as amplifiers of standardization. Parliamentary committees reviewing urban improvement schemes circulated templates for excavation and reporting. Sediment disposal. and foundation reinforcement. Language hardened into categories. Irregular cavities became legacy voids. Stone chambers became structural anomalies. Anything that did not fit neatly into sewerage, utilities, or load-bearing calculations was absorbed into terminology designed for continuation rather than interruption. The repetition carried weight, not dramatic repetition, administrative repetition, across cities, across counties, across departments that never spoke to one another directly. The same silences recurred in the same places. Biological references faded first. Measurements remained, but lost context. Diagrams persisted while captions thinned. Clerks' names appeared again and again at the bottom of approvals authorizing infill, rerouting, sealing. Yet Edinburgh did not match perfectly. Where other cities preserved partial sketches or excavation summaries, Edinburgh's files grew abruptly spare after 1861. Depth measurements shortened. Chamber outlines vanished between drafts. Burial documentation folded into broader redevelopment ledgers rather than remaining discrete. The divergence was subtle. It was also consistent. Certain clerks signed both cemetery revisions and street raising permits. Their handwriting linked separate municipal series, never intended to be read together. Approval cycles compressed. Questions once logged stopped reappearing. The comparison did not flatten the mystery. It sharpened it. If this was merely Victorian infrastructure responding to growth, Edinburgh's paperwork behaved differently, and a difference inside bureaucracies rarely occurs without cause. By this stage, the documents no longer sat in isolation. Burial registers could be plotted against drainage proposals, street elevations aligned with cemetery revisions, museum accession gaps overlapped redevelopment years. Private correspondence fell into the same decades that council minutes. Thinned, when arranged chronologically rather than by archive, the records formed a continuous arc rather than a scatter of anomalies. I slowed down here. Coincidence had to remain on the table. Victorian cities were busy systems. Construction overlapped with sanitation. Graves were relocated during expansion. Specimens vanished through neglect. Any one explanation worked in isolation. Together, they strained. Architectural chambers appeared before cemetery numbers changed. Storage crates disappeared after collectors circulated coded descriptions. Street raisings followed sealed vaults. Parliamentary templates standardized language at the same moment. Biological references began to fade. Each step could be defended administratively. None required malice. None demanded conspiracy. Yet the sequence persisted. Across decades, across departments, across professions that never met. The antagonistic force here did not resolve into people. It resolved into systems, permit offices, survey bureaus, clerical chains, transport logs, yet committees, whose mandate was continuity rather than disruption. What remained unanswered was motive, whether the impulse was embarrassment, institutional inertia, fear of reputational damage, or something quieter still, whether extraordinary fines were deemed socially inconvenient, whether preserving civic momentum mattered more than excavating uncertainty, whether cultural discomfort hardened into policy without ever being spoken aloud. I assembled the remaining gaps. Why burial depths shortened in successive drafts? Why sketches vanished between planning revisions? Why shipments left cities without recorded destinations? Why certain names repeated across unrelated municipal series? Why biological measurements disappeared, while stone dimensions remained? No verdict closed the file, only a narrowing field of questions, and the uncomfortable realization that the records were not chaotic. They were consistent, consistently incomplete, across generations of governance, across a city built upward, while its earlier layers were pressed back into silence. The alignment did not resolve the mystery. It made ignoring it increasingly difficult. I returned to the permit where the trail had begun. The same ledger page, the same tidy handwriting, the same approval stamps stacked in orderly columns. Nothing about it suggested controversy. No annotations in red ink. No revisions filed afterward. Just a routine authorization for underground expansion near the Old Town Ridge, issued, processed, archived. Except for the margin, a narrow line of graphite, lighter than the rest, pressed into the paper rather than written with confidence. 2 words abbreviated. A depth figure, crossed through and replaced with something shallower. And the phrase that refused to resolve no matter how many times I read it. Unexpected cavities. Every document that followed seemed to orbit that phrase without ever touching it directly. Street plans adjusted, burial records compressed, storage crates renumbered. Committees standardized their language, voids sealed, chambers relabeled, bones circulated privately and vanished from inventories. No single act closed the question. They accumulated instead. The system did not lurch. It flowed. The talks followed templates. Engineers reinforced foundations. Curators reorganized shelves. Councils approved budgets. Each step preserved momentum. Each step reduced friction. Each step nudged irregularities toward categories that allowed work to continue. What survived was not an explanation. What survived was paper. Paper that thinned where it should have thickened. Paper that smoothed irregularities into columns. Paper that carried stone measurements but dropped bodies. I resisted the urge to name intention. Intent is allowed. This was quiet, habitual, administrative, gravity applied through procedure rather than decree. Standing back from the archive, the shape of the inquiry widened beyond Edinburgh, whether I wanted it to or not. Victorian cities across Britain had tumbled, raised streets, rerouted drains, cleared burial grounds, filled voids. The same processes that concealed here would have operated elsewhere, just as methodically, just as politely. If subterranean chapters had been buried once, they could be buried again. Not through secrecy, through filing. The permit remained on record. So did everything that followed. And yet what it authorized no longer lay open to inspection. The investigation did not end. It paused. Above ground, while beneath modern streets, beneath pavements laid over generations of civic improvement, whatever first forced that pencil into the margin, waited without documentation. Still measured, still sealed, still absent from the story we tell about what our cities are built upon.